Friday evening, October 1932, a coal camp folded into a mountain hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky. At the company office, a line of men waits at the pay window, faces black with coal dust, lamps still hooked to their caps. Payday. A miner steps up. 2 weeks of work behind him. 10-hour shifts, half a mile underground, loading coal by hand, paid by the ton. The clerk slides a small brown envelope through the window. The miner doesn't open it right away. He already knows. Inside there are no dollars. There is a slip of paper, earned $26.40. Then the deductions, line by line. Rent for a company-owned house, the account at the company store, the company doctor's fee, and the blasting powder, because in 1932, a coal miner buys, out of his own pay, the explosives he uses to bring down the company's coal. Total deductions, $27 even. At the bottom of the slip, one last line, balance owed to the company, 60 cents, 2 weeks. Half a mile underground, and the number at the bottom says he owes them. Here's what that man cannot do. He cannot report it. No inspector is coming to this hollow. Kentucky's own constitution says miners must be paid in lawful money, a sentence that has never once been enforced here, and beyond the state line, nothing at all. No federal law says an employer owes a worker any particular wage. None caps his hours. None keeps his 12-year-old son out of the mine, and none, this is the part that stops people, says wages have to be paid in dollars. Company tokens will do. A brass coin with a corporation's name stamped on it, worthless one hollow over, passing year after year as a paycheck. The richest industrial nation on earth ran that way, not for a decade or two, but for 162 years, from independence in 1776 until one signature in the summer of 1938. So what was a day of an American's life actually worth in all those years? Who decided? And what happened to the people who tried to argue? The answers run through places the history classes tend to skip. A textile city where the first American wage earners, most of them teenage girls, invented the strike. A New York loft with locked doors and a fire ladder that stopped 3 floors too short. A West Virginia mountain where 10,000 miners fought a private army, under airplanes dropping bombs on American soil. A hotel chambermaid who beat the Supreme Court over $216, and a quiet woman who watched girls fall from a 9th-floor window in 1911, then spent 27 years preparing her answer, 2 drafts of it, locked in the bottom drawer of her desk. Because underneath the tokens and the payslips, this is a story about a question every society eventually has to answer. Is a human being's labor just a price, like coal or cotton, or is there a line below which no one is allowed to go? For most of American history, the official answer was simple: there is no line, let's open the vault. And the story starts in a country with almost no paychecks at all. In the early 1800s, asking the average American about his hourly wage would have earned you a blank stare. Roughly 8 out of 10 Americans lived on farms that ran on almost no cash at all. You grew what you ate, the rest you traded for, eggs for flour, a day's haying for help raising a barn. Cash was something a farm family saw a handful of times a year and held on to like medicine. The minority who worked for pay, apprentices in their masters' houses, journeymen negotiating one job at a time, worked inside arrangements almost like family. Nobody on earth could have told you the average American wage because no such creature existed. The first Americans to live on wages in the modern sense, clock in, clock out, cash on Saturday, were mostly teenage girls. In the 1820s and 1830s, the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, recruited thousands of young women off the New England farms. They lived in company boarding houses, worked 12 and 14 hours a day, in rooms so loud they learned to read lips, and earned around $3.25 a week, before the company took back $1.25 for room and board. Notice the shape. The employer pays the wage, then collects a piece of it back. Remember it. Later in this story, that shape grows teeth. And here's what the mill owners didn't expect. In 1836, when the companies effectively cut pay by raising the charge for board, some 1,500 Lowell girls did something with no real precedent in American life. They walked out together. They called it turning out. One ringleader was 11 years old, a Doffer girl named Harriet Hanson, who remembered decades later that when the older girls hesitated at the door, she announced she was turning out whether anyone else did or not, and marched, and the whole room fell in behind her. And this time the companies flinched. At several mills, the board increase was quietly withdrawn. Keep that image. Teenage girls inventing the American strike a generation before the Civil War and winning a round. Everything that follows is that scene, replayed bigger and bloodier for 100 years. What made it bigger was the machine. After the Civil War, the factory stopped being a New England curiosity and became the country itself. Steel in Pittsburgh, meatpacking in Chicago, textiles sliding south into the Carolinas, and coal underneath it all. What these operations needed was not craftsmanship. It was bodies, enormous numbers of them, repeating one motion 10 or 12 hours a day. And the bodies came. Millions of immigrants poured into American cities, fleeing famine and persecution, arriving into a labor market with no floor of any kind. So what did that market, left entirely to itself, decide a human being was worth? In the Gilded Age, an unskilled factory hand typically earned somewhere between 10 and 20 cents an hour. Call it $6 to $10 for a 6-day, 60-hour week. Now do the arithmetic every working family did at the kitchen table. Rent on a tenement room, $2 or $3 a week. Food, 3 or 4 more. Coal, boots, a doctor. The numbers do not close. For most families, one Gilded Age wage could not keep a family alive. Hold on to that arithmetic. We're coming back to it. And when workers pushed back, they discovered exactly where their government stood. The whole country saw it in the summer of 1877 when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, mid-Depression, announced its second 10% wage cut in a year. Brakemen in Martinsburg, West Virginia, one of the most lethal jobs in America, for less than $2 a day, simply stopped the trains, and the strike jumped the wires. Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, the first national strike in American history, with no national organization running it, less a strike, really, than an uprising. In Pittsburgh, the local militia refused to fire on their neighbors, so militia was brought in from Philadelphia, and they fired into the crowd. Roughly 20 people died, women and children among them. The city answered by burning the railroad, the Union Depot, the roundhouses, more than 100 locomotives, gone in a single night. By the time federal troops restored what the newspapers called order, something like 100 Americans were dead across the country, and there the pattern locked in, and for a generation it repeated like a machine stamping parts. Workers organize and ask, usually for the 8-hour day. Employers refuse, a strike, and then the full weight of the state lands on one side, and it is not labor's side. Haymarket Square, 1886. A bomb, 7 dead policemen, 4 organizers hanged after a trial historians still wince at. Pullman, 1894. 250,000 railroad workers out, federal troops in by the thousands. And as a consolation prize, a new federal holiday called Labor Day, signed while the strike was still being crushed. The shape never changes. Labor asks, capital declines, the state picks a side. But notice what nobody in power is proposing in any of it. A law about wages. Hours, occasionally, at the state level. Wages, never. In the America of 1890, that idea sat somewhere between socialism and lunacy. Meanwhile, the machine's cruelest output wasn't at the barricades at all. Go back to that kitchen table arithmetic, the wage that couldn't feed a family. There was exactly one way to close the gap, and every mill owner in America knew what it was. By 1900, roughly 1 American child in 5 between the ages of 10 and 15 held a job. And the census didn't seriously try to count the ones younger than that. Whole industries were engineered around it. Textile mills prized children because small fingers could dart into moving machinery to clear a jammed spindle. Glass factories ran boys through the night shift, hauling red-hot bottles from the furnaces. And in the anthracite country of Pennsylvania, the coal breakers employed boys of 8, 9, 10 years old, the breaker boys, perched over the chutes 10 hours a day, picking slate out of a moving river of coal with bare hands until their fingertips cracked open. A breaker boy's pay, 40 to 70 cents a day. His father, underground, often earned too little for the family to refuse it. The children had their defenders. In 1903, a white-haired organizer named Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, gathered a column of children from the Pennsylvania textile mills, some of them missing fingers, and marched them more than 100 miles from Philadelphia toward President Theodore Roosevelt's summer home on Long Island, behind banners asking for time to go to school. Roosevelt declined to see them, and when she asked why the mill children never made the front pages, she got, by her own account, an honest answer. The mill owners held stock in the papers. What finally cracked the silence wasn't a march. It was a camera. Starting in 1908, a schoolteacher named Lewis Hine crisscrossed the country for the National Child Labor Committee, talking his way past factory gates by posing as a fire inspector, a postcard salesman, a Bible seller. He photographed the breaker boys, the barefoot spinner girls, the 4-year-old shrimp pickers of the Gulf Coast, and since guards sometimes kept him from using a tape measure, he recorded the children's heights against the buttons of his own coat. His photographs did what 40 years of statistics had not. They made it impossible for the country to say it didn't know. So in 1916, Congress finally acted, the Keating-Owen Act, the first federal child labor law. It survived 2 years. In 1918, in Hammer versus Dagenhart, the Supreme Court struck it down, 5-4. Regulating child labor, the majority said, was beyond the powers of Congress. The suit had been brought in the name of a North Carolina mill worker's teenage sons. Years later, one of them, Reuben Dagenhart, told a reporter what his famous victory had been worth. No schooling, a body worn down since age 12. He'd have been better off, he said, if they had lost. As late as 1918, then, the settled law of the land was this. Not only can government not touch your wages, it cannot even keep a 12-year-old out of the cotton mill. Hold that thought. We will be back for the court. First, the 2 places where the system showed its purest form, the city sweatshop and the company town. In the loft buildings of Lower Manhattan, the garment industry had perfected a machine of its own. Contractors packed rented floors with sewing machines and hired the newest arrivals, immigrant women and girls, many in their teens, for piecework, 12-hour days, 6- and 7-day weeks, $3 to $6 a week in the worst shops, with pay docked for talking, for broken needles, even for the electricity. And in many shops, the doors were locked during working hours, management's answer to unauthorized breaks and pilfered shirtwaists. On Saturday, March 25, 1911, at quitting time, a fire started in a scrap bin on the 8th floor of the Ash Building just off Washington Square. The top 3 floors belonged to the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Fed on tissue paper and cotton cuttings, the fire moved faster than a person could run. On the 9th floor, workers rushed the exits and found a door locked. The single fire escape tore away from the wall under the weight of the people on it. The fire department came fast, and its tallest ladders reached the 6th floor. The fire was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. In under half an hour, 146 people were dead. Most were young women. The youngest were 14. Dozens, trapped between the flames and the window ledges, jumped in front of a street full of witnesses. One witness matters enormously. A 30-year-old social worker had been at a tea table on the far side of the square when the engines went past. She ran and watched workers step out of the 9th floor windows. Her name was Frances Perkins. She never got over that afternoon, and she never intended to. Years later, she would say flatly that the New Deal began on March 25, 1911. Remember her. When this story finally turns, she is the one who turns it. What happened next tells you what a worker's life was officially worth. The owners were tried for manslaughter. The jury acquitted them. Their insurance paid them roughly $400 per dead employee, more than their losses. The families who sued collected about $75. And 2 years later, one of the same owners was caught again, locking the door of his new factory. The fine was $20. New York, at least, was shamed into motion. A state commission spent 4 years crawling through factories and rewrote the state's labor code from the ground up, with Frances Perkins leading inspections. But a state law stopped at the state line. And out in the coal country, the state line was the least of it. Out there, in any practical sense, there was no state. There was the company. Now, that pay envelope from the beginning. Time to open it properly. Here's how a company town worked. A coal operator buys a hollow in West Virginia or eastern Kentucky. miles from the nearest independent town, which is the entire point. The company sinks the mine, then builds everything else: the houses, the store, the school, the church. A miner there sleeps in the company's house, buys at its store, prays in its pew, and when his child is born, the company doctor delivers it, the fee already deducted from his pay. And the pay itself, in camp after camp, came not in dollars, but in scrip, brass tokens, and printed slips, good only at the company store. The miners called them flickers, clackers, dugaloos. Scrip couldn't be banked, couldn't buy a train ticket, and one hollow over it was junk metal. At the only store that took it, prices ran well above town prices. Come up short before payday, and the store extended credit against your next envelope, which is how a man ends up mining coal for years and never holding a dollar. Always one account behind, working to pay for the privilege of working. Britain outlawed paying wages in goods back in 1831. American states wrote bans of their own, and in company country they sat on the books, unenforced, decade after decade. When Merle Travis wrote 16 Tons in 1946, its famous line, "I owe my soul to the company store," wasn't a metaphor. It was his own father's phrase, from the Kentucky coal fields. And what the script bought was survival inside the most murderous industry in the country. In 1907 alone, American coal mines killed more than 3,000 men. That December, one explosion at Monongah, West Virginia, officially killed 362 miners. Officially, because nobody had recorded the boys and helpers working off the books. So miners organized. The companies answered with blacklists, evictions, hired detectives, and then some. This is where the wage question in America stops being a metaphorical war. April 20th, 1914. Ludlow, Colorado. Miners striking against a Rockefeller-controlled coal company had been evicted from company houses and were wintering with their families in a tent colony until National Guardsmen and company guards raked it with machine gun fire and burned it. In a dirt cellar beneath one tent, 2 women and 11 children suffocated. The country was horrified. The wage laws did not change. West Virginia, 1920. In the town of Mattawan, a young police chief named Sid Hatfield sided with evicted miners against the Baldwin Felts detectives sent to throw their families into the street. The shootout on the main street left 10 men dead, 7 of them detectives. A year later, Baldwin Felts agents shot Hatfield dead on the courthouse steps in front of his wife. No one was ever punished. That was the match. In the late summer of 1921, as many as 10,000 armed miners tied red bandanas around their necks, the origin, some say, of a word you've heard, and marched on Logan County to break the coal operators' grip by force. At Blair Mountain, they met a defending army of roughly 3,000 deputies, mine guards, and volunteers, dug in with machine guns. For the better part of a week, the two sides fought across a 10-mile front. By some estimates, 1 million rounds were fired, while hired biplanes dropped gas and pipe bombs on the miners' positions. Private aircraft, bombing American workers on American soil. It ended only when the United States Army arrived, the largest armed uprising in the country since the Civil War, and most Americans have never heard of it. And when the smoke cleared, the paycheck in the coal camps was still scrip, still untouched, still 60 cents owed. So why didn't someone simply pass a law? Here's the thing. They tried. And every attempt ran into a wall with 9 old men sitting on top of it. In 1905, New York had a law limiting bakers to 10 hours a day. Bakeries then were basement rooms of flour dust and gas fumes. The Supreme Court disagreed. In Lochner versus New York, it struck the law down for violating what it called liberty of contract, the baker's sacred constitutional freedom to negotiate his own hours. A grand-sounding principle with one defect. It imagines the immigrant baker and the man who owns the bakery meeting as equals, when one of them can replace the other by breakfast, and both of them know it. Freedom of contract, for the man with no options, is the freedom to accept. For 30 years, that doctrine was the wall. One crack appeared. In 1908, the court let Oregon cap working hours for women, on the era's logic that women needed guarding, and reformers drove through it. In 1912, Massachusetts enacted America's first minimum wage law for women and children. Its enforcement mechanism is my favorite detail of the era. Employers who refused to pay the recommended rate had their names printed in the newspapers. That was the whole penalty. Shame as wage policy. A dozen states followed, most just as toothless. Then even the toothless versions died. In 1923, in Adkins versus Children's Hospital, the court struck down the District of Columbia's minimum wage for women. Liberty of contract again. The case came with a bitter twist. Among the plaintiffs was a 21-year-old elevator operator named Willie Lyons, suing to kill the wage law that covered her, because, she said, her hotel would replace her with a man if it were forced to pay the female minimum. The employer's freedom argument had learned to wear a working woman's coat. It worked. Minimum wage laws across the country were dead letters by the mid-1920s. Now, a fair question. Couldn't the market fix this by itself? Here's the strangest data point of the age. In January 1914, Henry Ford announced he would pay $5 a day, roughly double the going rate, not out of charity, but because his assembly line was so unbearable that in 1913 he had hired 52,000 men to keep about 14,000 jobs filled. The morning after the announcement, 10,000 men mobbed the Highland Park gates, and the crowd was dispersed with fire hoses in January. But the $5 came with strings. To qualify, a worker submitted to Ford's sociological department, whose investigators visited his home to check whether he drank, whether he gambled, whether his marriage was in order. Even the market's one great wage miracle arrived with an inspector for your living room, and it stayed one company's experiment. For everyone else, the floor remained where it had always been, nowhere. It took the collapse of the entire economy to move the wall. The crash of October 1929 set off 4 years of freefall, and by 1933, one American worker in 4 had no job at all. For those still employed, the market's logic ran in one direction. With desperate replacements outside every gate, wages went through the floor because there was no floor. A garment worker who had earned $11 a week in 1929 could find herself sewing the same seams for 4 or 5 by 1932. The sweatshops New York thought it had buried after the Triangle Fire came back from the dead. Investigators found shops paying grown women a nickel an hour. Into this walked Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in November 1932, and he brought with him the woman from the far side of Washington Square. Roosevelt asked Frances Perkins to be his Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever named to a presidential cabinet. Before she accepted, she came to him with a list and read it aloud. Abolition of child labor, a minimum wage, a ceiling on hours, unemployment insurance, old age insurance. She would take the job only if he stood behind the list. He said yes. The one-sentence history of New Deal labor policy. A woman who had watched the Triangle Girls fall spent the next decade crossing items off that list. The first swing came fast. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. Industry codes with minimum wages inside them. The Blue Eagle going up in shop windows across the country. Signing it, Roosevelt said the quiet part in public, "No business which depends for its existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." Then, in 1935, the Supreme Court met the Schechter brothers, Brooklyn poultry dealers charged under the codes in what the papers gleefully called the sick chicken case, and struck the entire apparatus down unanimously. The wall was still there. But Perkins had planned for this. In the locked bottom drawer of her desk, she kept 2 draft bills for a national wage and hour law, engineered specifically to survive the Supreme Court, waiting for the day the court blinked. The blink came from Wenatchee, Washington. A chambermaid named Elsie Parrish, a grandmother, had spent 2 years cleaning rooms at the Cascadian Hotel for around 25 cents an hour. Washington State still had a minimum wage law for women on its books from 1913, one of the old toothless survivors, and under it, hotel work owed $14.50 a week. Parrish did the arithmetic and sued the hotel for the difference, $216.19. The hotel's defense was, in effect, one word: Adkins. The case climbed all the way up. And on March 29, 1937, with Roosevelt's war on the court at full boil, the Supreme Court upheld the Washington law 5-4, overruled Adkins by name, and retired liberty of contract as a weapon against wage laws. One justice had changed sides. The newspapers called it the switch in time that saved nine. A chambermaid's $216 had knocked the keystone out of a 30-year wall. Roosevelt turned to Perkins and asked what had become of her bills. Out of the drawer they came. The fight in Congress was still ugly. Southern legislators fought the bill because the South's economy ran on labor that was cheap by design, much of it black labor. The price of their votes was carved directly into the law. Farm laborers and domestic workers, the fields where black Americans were concentrated, were excluded entirely, an exclusion whose consequences ran on for decades. Business lobbies predicted the usual apocalypse. Roosevelt, in a fireside chat, told the country not to let any calamity-howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day argue that a wage of $11 a week would wreck American industry. On June 25, 1938, Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act. Here is what it did: a federal minimum wage, 25 cents an hour; a standard work week, 44 hours, heading down to 40. Past that, overtime at time and a half. A federal ban on oppressive child labor, the thing the court had said 20 years earlier Congress had no power to touch. And payment in dollars, real, legal tender, spend anywhere dollars. The brass token, the company store paycheck, the 60 cents owed at the bottom of the slip, for every worker the law reached, finally against federal law. It covered at first only about one worker in 5, and expanding it took decades. But that misses the point of June 25, 1938. For the first time in American history, the government said to an employer, "There is a number below which you may not go. There is a line. 25 cents an hour comes out to something like $5.50 in today's money." As a wage, it was almost nothing. But the height of the floor was never the point. The point was the sentence underneath. A human being's labor is not just a price. Count what that sentence cost. A depot burning in Pittsburgh and 100 dead in a summer. 4 men hanged in Chicago. 146 dead a block off Washington Square. 2 women and 11 children in a dirt cellar at Ludlow. Bombs falling on a West Virginia mountain. And, at the very end, a chambermaid's $216 and a list read aloud in Franklin Roosevelt's study. And none of this is ancient history. The Triangle Fire happened within your great-grandmother's lifetime. There are reports of scrip circulating illegally in corners of the Deep South into the 1960s. The protections stitched into an ordinary American paycheck are not old traditions. They are recent, and they were expensive. Since 1938, the federal minimum has been raised more than 20 times, most recently in 2009 to $7.25, where it still sits. Its purchasing power peaked back in 1968. Where the line belongs now, that argument has never stopped, and it isn't this episode's business. Ours is the fact people forget. For most of American history, there was no line at all. The wage could be anything the most desperate person in town would take. It could be a brass token. It could be 60 cents owed. So the next time a paycheck lands in your account, look at the first line, the wage, in dollars, with a floor under it, and know what's standing behind that boring little number. A girl of 11 walking out of a spinning room. A man with a borrowed fire inspector's badge and a camera. A red bandana on a mountainside. 2 bills in a locked desk drawer, waiting for the court to blink. Here's the question for the comments. And the answers to this one are always better history than anything we can script. What is the lowest wage you, or your parents, or your grandparents ever worked for? And what year was it? Tell us below. And if stories like this are your kind of thing, the hidden machinery under everything America takes for granted, subscribe and open the vault with us. The archives go deeper than they look.